All those opposed to the motion will
Now
please
on
rise.
to the government side. The Conservatives and all these people, of course, are expected to vote against the motion to defeat themselves.
Southeast. Mr. Moore, Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam. Mr. Paradis. Mr. Zaglutkat. Mr. Blackburn. Mr. Duncan, Vancouver Island North. Mr. Kent. Mr. Abbott. Mr. Richardson. Mr. Benoit. Mr. Brightcraig. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Lake. Mr. Kenny South Shore St. Margaret. Mr. Warawa. Mr. McKenzie. Mr. Fantino. Mr. Goodyear. Mr. Merrifield. Mrs. Yelich. Madame Belknap. Mr. O'Connor. Ms. Ambrose. Ms. Oda. Mr. Lebel. Mr. Moore Fundy Royal. Mr. Lund. Mr. Menzies. Mr. Camp at Meadows Maple Ridge Mission. Mr. Dykstra. Mr. Del Mastro. Mr. Gould. Mr. Carey. Mr. Harris Caribou Prince George. Mr. Cummins. Mr. Anders. Mr. Casson. Mr. Goldring. Mr. Belnier. Mr. Song. Mr. Bellicott. Mrs. Gallant. Mr. Rickford. Mr. Kerr. Mr. O'Brien. Mr. Petit. Mr. Hahn. Mr. Poiliev. Mr. Lukiski. Mrs. Wong. Mrs. Glover. Madame Boucher. Mr. Anderson. Mr. Jean. Mr. Kamarnicki. Mr. Lemieux. Mr. Saxton. Mr. Deckert. Ms. Brown, Newmarket Aurora. Mrs. McLeod. Mr. Lunny. Mr. Rajat. Mr. Reed. Mr. Sorensen. Mr. Schellenberger. Mr. Allison. Mr. Bazan. Mr. Brown Leeds Grenville. Mrs. Graywall. Mr. Hebert. Mr. Cramp Prince Edward Hastings. Mr. Miller. Mr. Preston. Mrs. Smith.
Apparently the only member not in the House today is Liberal Keith Martin. He is in New York on business-related issues. He's a Liberal, and he is also not running again. So only one member missing that we've heard of so far. We're now still on the government side and voting, and noting that some of them are wearing red ties today. What is that? A thank you to the Liberals for bringing this motion forward so that they can have an election?
Mr. Shipley. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Storseth. Mr. Sweet. Mr. Van Kesteren. Mr. Wallace. Mr. Workington. Mr. Scheer. Mr. DeBolin. Mr. Clark. Mrs. Blanc.
143 Conservatives back into the last row.
Mr. Calandra. Mr. Shorey. Mr. Dreeshen. Mr. Hobart. Ms. Hepner. Mr. Holder. Mr. Laub. Mr. McColman. Mrs. O'Neill Gordon. Mr. Payne. Mr. Rathfaber. Mr. Upal. Mr. Richards. Mr. Weston, West Vancouver Sunshine Coast Sea to Sky Country. Mr. Weston St. John. Mr. Woodworth. Mr. Young. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Genereux. Mr. Sopak. Ms. Georges. Mr. Aptul.